I don't know if I'm Vesuvius, or, but I think it's, you're right. It's definitely, when I have grad students, postdocs come into my office and I see the misery that they're going through, and I try to explain to them it's just part of the process, and what I usually tell them is how much better it is on the other side of the desk. And it's really true. Like, you'll hear that it's more difficult, but no, it's a lot easier. They just don't want to tell you that, but it is. It's much better on the other side of the desk. I'm going to talk to you today about a series of studies that probably on my CV might think that they are different topics, are really, in my mind, connected. And I'm going to try to give you the story of how they connect. But most of the time I'm going to be talking about facial expressions. That might give you the impression that my research program is on facial expressions. It is not. I'm interested in emotions, what they are. By the time that I leave this planet, I'd like to have a better idea of what they are in terms of the mind and the brain. If someone tells you that they have a really good idea of what they are, they're really lying to you. At least that's my expert opinion. So this is my research program is both personal and theoretical. I'd like to understand better what emotions are. So the approach that I've taken to studying that is trying to go back and ask some basic questions about why facial expressions exist, what they're for, to get some insights into maybe the nature of emotions. So I'm going to start off with a little video of a child who plays the amazing Scary Maze game. This is something that her parents decided would be fun. And indeed, it is fun. So what she's doing right now is she's navigating a little pixel through a maze, and this maze gets smaller and smaller, more and more challenging to navigate. See, and this is something we're also learning about human nature. We have awes, and then laughter, and then this is poor this gentleman, this psychopath over here. I don't know who you are, but I'm afraid of you. There is. So, there are lots of lessons to learn here. The idea of why foster parents are good. Why, I mean, as a relatively recent parent, how you think things would be fun to do with your children, yet it could be life and brain altering. The part that I'm going to focus on here is the expression that she made, and the power of that expression reverberated in you to feel for her, right? Like all these are, photons. You hear, there was some sound, but it was really a pattern of information on your retinas that made you feel something for this poor child. And the salience of that makes us believe that facial expressions are indeed a communicative act whereby we are transferring our own emotional states and concerns to the brains of another person. It's a form of theory of mind where you're sharing a mental state to the point that you're really feeling for her. You felt about her and had concerns about her, or laughed at the face of her fear. What I'm going to suggest, just because I'm kind of, I wouldn't call it cranky, maybe a little bit difficult, is that I'm interested in potentially the non-social, non-empathic origins of facial expressions. So although there's no doubt that they're very potent movers of our feelings for communicating, the origin of them might have been something very different. Now, in the present day, there really are for this resonance, this kind of emotional contagion, but why do they look precisely the way they do? So why did she open her eyes? Why did she make this configuration on her face? Why is that a really potent way for us to share in her emotional feelings? Was there something about those visual cues that somehow are inherently meaningful that make us feel for her? And I think, well, the answer to that is probably no, but that's not what my research topic is on. It's really trying to understand those visual features as existing for another purpose. Okay, let's take another perspective on this. If you travel the world, you tend to have this default, partly informed idea that your expressions are universal. I mean, as a psychologist, you know that that's really not the truth. Like, you know that there are cultural variations, but you tend to not think about, oh, I really shouldn't smile in this context because that would be really taken as aggressive. You know, you feel free to show smiles and think that this is some type of exchange that would be appetitive. You don't question that. However, your language you can't translate easily. So you think you use a universal language of expression. This does not really always apply. And so one, I think, really good example is gestures like the thumbs up sign, and in particular in Persia, it makes sense once you know about it. So if you're from North America, you think of this as being a good thing. If you're from Persia, it means up yours, right? So this, and then, you know, when you look at this, you're like, oh yeah, up yours. That makes a totally good up your symbol. And so the problem with that is it has some colossal implications. So here's George Bush going around, you know, flipping off the rest of Persia all the time. And the Persians thinking, like, why is this guy saying he's our friend and giving us essentially the middle finger all the time? And on the ground, when the troops arrived and they were in the streets, seeing the locals giving them these signs of welcome, right? And so here, are they translating? Do they know, like, we're saying yes, this is a welcome to the streets of Iraq? Or is this really an example of how many expressions are really culturally construed, and that we need a translator? Now this captures a debate that I recently participated in a debate on something along these, about these two views. I will let you know my biases is I tend to work more in this idea of a basic emotion camp. So you should take everything I say with understanding that this is the perspective I largely research from. However, at the same time, I understand that emotions are not just something that God, evolution gave us as adaptations, but are socially constructed in a culture. And you know, this is really, it's quite a ridiculous debate to have, because any reasonable psychologist would be interested in both of these perspectives, to understand what biology gives us, and then understanding how culture then shapes that and uses that to change things. So the facial expressions tend to be used as examples of natural kinds, something that was given to us by our genes, whereas gestures often are a really good example of things that are clearly arbitrary, that there's something that within a culture you have to agree upon that this maps onto a certain meaning. And so what I'm going to argue is that in the case of facial expressions, there is some evidence that they are non-arbitrary, that they look the way they do for a specific purpose. So one view would be they're arbitrary mappings. So just like this can be mapped to something good or something bad. As long as we agree in a culture, what actually looks like doesn't matter. It's just a symbol. As long as there's an internal representation of what it is in our culture, then the actual external symbol doesn't mean anything. In facial expressions, what we found is that there is meaning derived directly from the way facial expressions look. So what's another way of saying this? So if you look at human similarity ratings across different facial expressions, anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise, what you find are their systematic relationships and how people perceive them in terms of their similarity and dissimilarity. So anger and disgust tend to be more similar. Strangely, and this has turned out to be the case, we've seen a number of times disgust and happiness are kind of similar. But there are other relationships where they're dissimilar, like disgust appears to be far away from fear. Fear is close to surprise. There are all these different relationships that might have something to do with our internal emotional competence of understanding things about emotions. Right? It might be something that we learn. It's not the face itself, it's just emotional competence. Our cultures have taught us to map these things onto certain feeling states or concepts that have similarity, dissimilarity relationships. What Josh, my former grad student, who's now, he's a principal at the company Emotionant, so you can read about him. Often his work is in the New York Times on being used to develop facial expression recognition systems for automobiles and all kinds of crazy things that he could make a lot of money doing, more than being a professor. He started doing some simple work on getting a machine to look at facial expressions. Basically, our machine here is equivalent to a visual cortex. It only sees, it knows nothing about emotions. It just has representations that a visual cortex would have. It deals with the visual structure of the environment. And what we find is in this machine that knows nothing about, has no emotional competence, has never felt anything in its life, it captures the similarity relationships that humans capture amongst these expressions. Why is this important? Well, this means that there's something there. There's something in the face that communicates its underlying meaning, that it's not just some surface association. You can read emotions directly from the structure of the face. There's something inherent to the structure that suggests that they're not arbitrarily shaped, some meaning association, but there's something about the way they look that communicates that's related to feeling states. And so we've been doing a lot of work in trying to understand those structural relationships and what they reveal about emotions. So that's my pitch for saying facial expressions are not arbitrary. I will try to give you some more evidence for that. Then the question is, well, what are the forces that shape the way they look? It is the questions like, why does a fear expression look like it does? Why couldn't it look like something else, right? If a culture decided on that, as long as we all agreed, that would be fine. This suggests we think that, well, that's not going to happen in the world. There's a reason why fear expressions look the way they do. And what are those reasons? What are the selective pressures? So what we've done is, and I don't want to give Darwin too much credit, because many of the things that we've done are really, they're loosely inspired by some of Darwin's kind of silly observations about expressions in the world with really bad techniques. But the thing that I take from Darwin that's most important are some of his proposed principles that we've examined in different ways. So his two principles that he tried to lay out to account for expressive behavior, I've renamed to the principle of function and form. The archaic name is the principle of serviceable associated habits was one of his. It's really, we tried to publish the paper with that in the title and were rejected over and over and over again. And I finally realized, like, all right, so it's like, it's not the data. It's really, it's a mouthful to say principle of serviceable associated habits. This is a principle of function. Essentially, it's saying that expressions originated not as simple ways of communicating for the perceiver. Like you tend to, if it's communication, it's something to transmit, that someone has to pick that signal up. It's really more for the sender. It has some adaptive function for the person who's emoting. It's for them. It's more egocentric than altruistic. So therefore, it's not necessarily social. And the other principle, which I've become really enamored with, is I call it the principle of form. Darwin called it the principle of antithesis, which is that opposite mental states are associated with opposite actions and behaviors. And so we can then start to think about the structure of expressions and maybe the structure of emotions as regarding this opponent or oppositional structure to make sense of the way things appear. This is a chance to say, at least within psychology and neuroscience, I think that Darwin is misunderstood. His legacy, it's very strange as a student of this, thinking that Darwin has been associated with the basic emotions view, that there are distinct specializations of these unique expressions. And then I remember going back and reading even Paul Ekman's own edition of Darwin's book. And Paul Ekman is the one who's responsible for pushing the basic emotions idea. But when you read the book, the principle is the principle of antithesis, which means that facial expressions are not unique. They're actually connected along a dimension. That turns out to be the alternative competing view of the basic emotions world. And it's really just odd as a researcher to see, like, actually Darwin supported the opposing view in the current literature. The opposing view is that emotional expressions are not distinct kinds, but they vary along dimensions of things like valence and arousal. In fact, that's something that Darwin probably would have been really happy about. That's one of his foundational principles, but Ekman decided to change the story and say that Darwin was talking more about distinct basic kinds. The other aspect that's different from what Darwin intended is that we tend to examine emotions for the sake of communication, and Darwin was really arguing that emotions originated for some other function than communication. I mean, as humans, we understand they're for communication. We use them for that purpose. We didn't need Darwin to say that to us. I mean, that's how we tend to think of emotions. However, he argued, and this, he was being a curmudgeon. Let's think of some potential other functional role for expressions that could allow them to be in other animals besides humans that maybe don't have the same mental states as we do, so there would be continuity. I'm not going to present any data on continuity today. I'd like to do so. Most of our work is done, all of our work is done in humans. Okay, so the data, so finally, some data. I'm going to try to tell you about, so there are 3 things I want to communicate. 1, provide evidence for Darwin's principle of form. That is the opposition idea, that actually expressions that we think of as unique do come in pairs. They are opposites. And I'm going to use the data from the basic emotions world that they were constructed to be separate types and show even in that best case of trying to make distinct kinds of expressions, when you mathematically look at their structure, there's opposition there. That there are oppositions in terms of the facial appearance. And then I say, well, why is that? It's because the opposition in structure is related to an opposition in function, what it does for regulating sensory intake. The idea is facial expressions are on the face. You have lots of sensory receptors on the face. By changing the configuration of your face, you change sensory intake. Maybe that's not such a sexy view of what facial expressions are for, but would provide fundamental invariant principles about the physics of light that might influence what we do with our face to be able to filter inputs from the world. And then the last part, if I get to, because I'm really taking a long time right now, is to argue, is not to leave you with maybe that part is not so interesting to social psychologists, is to think that how facial expressions or these basic sensory regulatory functions have been exapted or piggybacked onto or moved, shaped to have social functions. So how do you co-opt this sensory regulatory function to be about social regulation? And to leave you with the idea we believe this is a principle of brain design. Like one of the things that we've been examining in the lab is to how to harness, to exact basic sensory principles for complex social behavior, that they originate in basic sensory adaptations. Instead of thinking of like the social module in some part of your brain, is to think that what evolution has done is to borrow from these sensory regulatory functions, exact them for the purposes of the complex social world. That's a whole other talk, but I'll give you a little taste of that. Okay, let's do the form part first, quickly. So Josh made a computer program, an appearance model that described the structure of facial expressions, both in terms of their texture and geometry. It's basically a PCA model capturing 2 dimensions of faces. In that way, any face can be represented in this model according to a number of different dimensions. So this is a higher dimensional model that captures the appearance of facial expressions. The facial expressions that are present in the model, we give them all different kinds of, the model sees all different kinds of facial expressions, different genders, races, some different ages. It's thrown all kinds of variants. It's not a facial expression model, it's just appearance. It's intended to restructure, to capture face appearance. So it's not really a facial expression model. In doing that, this model allows us to, 1, reconstruct prototypes that don't exist in the real world. We can say, okay, show us what the prototypical fear face looks like across all the exemplars we've fed you in this model. And we will get something that's not available in any database. It's just a statistical model of what the prototypical across genders, races, ages is. And so these are the prototypes we get for this disgust, happiness, anger, surprise, fear, and sadness. The other thing about this model that's nice is that it's generative, meaning you can choose, you could say, show me what this looks like. I'll throw in some numbers with a certain weighting, and you can visualize novel expressions. And this becomes really critical for one of the things we're going to try to do, which is to look at something called an antiface, a mathematical inversion of a facial expression, which we wouldn't have been able to do without the model. we can actually ask, like, oh, invert this in higher dimensional space and show me what that looks like, because that's one of our indices of what opposite is. That's kind of cool. I remember when Josh was like, yeah, let's do that. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's pretty simple. I wouldn't have been able to do it on paper. Like, you can't, and it revealed some things that I never thought about facial expressions before. Like, no model thought of this, but it fell out of the computational model and turns out, I think, to be a realistic portrayal of reality. Okay, so the first thing to know is that, so I've plotted, before I showed you a circumplex where we had colored dots. This is a little bit fancier. We're using the metaphor of a color wheel, but now it's an expression wheel. This is humans, how they see the different prototypes, how they see their relations to each other. And what's shown around the perimeter of the expression wheel are the different emotions and how people rate them in terms of their similarity. So these are expressions that people see as being similar. And as you go across the color wheel, the expression wheel, these are most dissimilar in terms of ratings. And so these are simulations of the ratings that we have from people's expressions. What we find is the appearance model captures the same structure. This is a replication of what we showed before. That was just a visual cortex. This is another model saying, hey, the relationships we see between different emotions, they're in the faces. They're not, again, this internal feeling space or conceptual space. It's in the structure of facial expressions, like recaptures that. Okay, so we've replicated that. But I'll go back to this for a second. So one of the things I'd like to tell you that from this, we could have saved many years of work if some journal reviewer would have allowed us to say, we actually didn't try to do this, but maybe we could have gotten away with it, is that these expressions across the circle are opposites of each other. You know, very smart people can make stupid claims like that, and I wouldn't put it past myself. But we thought for a long time, it's like, what does it mean? What does opposition mean? And we kept, running into the wall thinking, like, are things really, what does it mean for them to be opposites? We know from this MDS plot, there is nothing we can say about opposition here. All we can say about it, all we can comment on is relative similarity and dissimilarity. Across the circle doesn't mean these two things are opposites of each other, it just means that they're most dissimilar from each other. So what is, it's displayed oppositely on the MDS, but that doesn't reveal opposition. So Josh and I and Melissa came up with a few different indices of how would we define something as opposite. What would opposite mean? And so we have 4 indices that we came up with to convince ourselves that these expressions on opposite sides of the expression wheel are indeed opposites. One is the idea of antifaces that I've already talked about, mathematical inversions. Like if we mathematically invert a face, does it end up resulting in the face that's on the opposite side of the circle? Is that it's literally a mathematical opposite? The idea of cancellation. If two things are going in opposite directions, when you add them, what happens? They cancel each other out. They go to neutral. If you have two facial expressions that are opposites, we average them, we should get neutral. Contrast. If we subtract two expressions that are in different directions, they should enhance each other's appearance. And the idea of adaptation and aftereffects. In fact, although that's probably the neatest demo, is probably the least powerful in terms of talking about opposition, but it's one of the things that we examined. Okay, the idea of antifaces, really conceptually simple if you have a model to do it. We have a model that represents faces in terms of mathematical numbers, dimensions. All you have to do is say, I'm going to take fear and I'm going to -1 that. What happens? I'll take disgust and I'll -1. I'll multiply it by -1, flip it over the origin, show me what that looks like. And this gives us the ability to ask, do expressions have opposites? Now, there's no reason why from the model that this should work, partly because there's so much variance in there. We didn't make an emotion model. This is just a face model. It's not just about, it's about all kinds of data. It's about who knows what's going to happen. That sensible things actually happened were pretty impressive to us. Okay, so here are results in 2 different forms. So here are the original faces, the prototypes. These are the inversions. These are the flips in space. You take disgust, you invert it. It looks like anti-disgust looks like fear. You take fear, you invert it, you get mild constipation. However, to this computer model that doesn't appreciate such subtleties or non-linearities of expression, that it looks a lot like disgust. Indeed, when we look at the correlation between the antiface of fear and disgust is really high in the computer model. To us, we can see that it's like not a perfect exemplar of disgust, but it looks damn like it. Happiness becomes sadness. Mopey looking sadness becomes a kind of mild version of insanity. That, again, as an expert human perceiver, this is why, like, the non-linearities, this is a linear model where it really looks like, to the model, if the model was the perceiver, it would be like, yeah, that's happiness. The mouth is open, it has the right features. But as an expert human perceiver, we see there's like some craziness around the eyes. Like, this is the kind of like, I'm happy to see you, in the kind of look like I'm going to cut you to pieces kind of look. Like, it really is unsettling. Again, to us, we appreciate that, but to the model, not so much. But in general, if we ask human observers to rate these, and this is a polar plot of faces and their antifaces, and this is related to thinking about rating the target emotion versus the adjacent emotions on the circumplex versus the opposite ones, we find, like we've seen before, for faces that people agree about what they should be in terms of that they maximally match the intended label, and that antifaces are 180-degree rotation of this. So that you see the antiface of a face as you say it's least like the thing that it derived from. It's most like what we predict to be its opposite based on the circle. Okay, cancellation. This is it's kind of a fancy plot. I'm going to try to communicate how this experiment works. Imagine we have an expression wheel using the metaphor of a color wheel. This is the original color wheel, expression wheel that we've been dealing with. Imagine what I then do is superimpose on top of that another color wheel that's 180 degrees rotated, and then see the resulting expressions from that 180-degree rotation. You can imagine this in color world, where if I were to do that, how the colors would cancel each other out. And so what's displayed here is these are the facial these are the facial expressions that result from adding 180-degree rotation across the wheel. And what you see is they all tend to converge towards the neutral face. As expert perceivers, you can see evidence, like still residues of like it's not perfectly neutral, but very close to what the neutral expression is. What's displayed in here, these colors, is discrimination from neutral. So this is a depiction here from chance to 100% discrimination, and observers, when asked to discriminate each of these expressions from the neutral expression, show close to chance discrimination. So even though when we stare at it, we can see some differences, in actuality, our brains are finding it very difficult to discriminate these. Adding opposites has canceled the appearance of a facial expression. Okay. This is my favorite illustration. I don't even need, we have data to show it, but it's very convincing to me. Seems so simple. It's really a corollary of this other experiment where we're looking at cancellation. Here we have very weak versions of prototypes. We've taken a 50% version of this is fear, this is sadness, this is anger, this is disgust, this is happy, this is surprise. Some of these you might recognize. I'm having difficulty myself looking at them, but I know what they are. They are weak exemplars. They've been watered down. Then what we're going to do is subtract from them their opposite. And this is the contrast idea, is that if we remove the opposite action tendencies from these weak versions, what we should do is result in a full-blown, strong version. We've created contrast. You can think of this as when you see a smile, part of what a smile is the absence of sadness in it. And we're showing that mathematically by if we subtract sadness, so here's, if we subtract sadness from happiness, this should make a really happy face because they're opposing action tendencies, they're opposites, and this is what we find. Why are you laughing? So they're like caricatures, obviously, but the caricatures are revealing this is how we've made and we took This is taking fear and removing this little bit of disgust, and that makes a hyper fear face. We get this really super mopey face that I see from my children. And it's like, that's how do you make that? You know, like, we know that's the mopey face, but how do you make it? Well, you take a sad face and you actually, when your child makes the mopey face, what they're doing is subtracting happiness. They're like, I'm communicating to you not just mopiness, but the absence of happiness, a profound lack of happiness. So removing surprise from anger results in more anger. Removing fear from disgust results in more disgust. Removing sadness from happiness, again, gives the insane happy face. I'm so happy. Again, it's the removal of sadness is expressive. So inherent in a facial expression, and maybe this is a bit, you know, artful or metaphorical, is the absence of an opposite. So you don't think of that, and that's not the view that we have from basic emotions that are supposed to be independent from each other. This is consistent with the idea of antithesis, that facial expressions, they exist, they have specific structural relationships that are not arbitrary. They're structured to be opposing. Why? Why is that? So the thing that that's a different question, right? So I'm going to show you evidence of this one last aspect of opponency, and then we'll get on to trying to answer why that actually would be. Okay, so the last demo is a little bit of facial expression adaptation. So if you stare at this, so please, I'm going to stare at each one of these for about 8 seconds, and then I'm going to show you a second face briefly. And what I want you to do is hold on to what you see in that second face, the emotion that you see in the second face. So I'm going to go through a few dyads like this. Okay, so it's the second face I'm interested in. Stare at this, please. Okay, this. Okay, so here's the deal. So if the second face, as you maybe figured out, in each of those pairs was the identical face. So if you saw any change in the second face across those trials, that was the work of adaptation. That wasn't reality. That was your brain telling you something. It was a warping of perception. We've done way too many control experiments. Melissa she was a part of many of the control experiments of trying to control for all kinds of low-level feature explanations of this. We've had drifting gratings across them, changes in visual field location, scaling in size to see that it's not just simple basic features. There appears to be some deeper level of adaptation about the pairing of these different facial expressions. What you find is basically what we've done is show you faces and then adapt you over 8 seconds and then show you the same average face. And that average face was pushed in a direction opposite of it. And these are the data. Again, a kind of polar plot is that when you adapt to anti-faces, that pushes you towards seeing the face. So if you adapt to anti-happy, you tend to say the neutral face looks like it's happiness. If you adapted to happiness, the face, it will push you towards its predicted opposite, sadness. And this is across, so this is averaging across all of that space. So I'm not trying to make an argument for distinct emotions, but across that entire facial expression space, we can see this pushing in the opposite direction based on adaptation. And I don't know why I find this particularly meaningful. I don't know if it's impressive, but convincing to me. We've done many studies partly because we kept doubting ourselves that it was some kind of artifact and we were really being stupid, that we were missing something. This is an experiment where we took expressions across the entire emotion circle and used them as adapting faces. This is the same circumplex we've seen that's color-coded like a color wheel in terms of how people rate the similarity of different faces that they're going to be adapted to. This is the same circle we've seen over and over again. But these are the adapting faces. What's on the right side are the after effects, the scaling or the multidimensional scaling of the effect of adaptation on the neutral face. So what's being shown here are ratings of the same neutral face after adaptation to each of the faces around this circle. And what you find is a complete inversion of the adapting faces. The whole circle is flipped 180 degrees, even though what's being rated each time here is the same neutral average face. What you're finding is it pushes it across the entire circle to the other side of the circle. We've inverted the circumflex through adaptation. So we tried to do this in different variations of this in pre-literate cultures. Our collaborator died on us, which suggested to us we should stop that research program and start doing something else for a while. We went to something less, we couldn't go as far as pre-literate cultures, but we went to the Malaysian Peninsula, where we know there are pronounced differences in facial expression recognition of basic emotions. And we wanted to see if even in cultures that show differences in appreciation of basic expressions, do they pick up on this idea of opponency? So if you travel to another part of the world, do they think of happy and sad expressions as being opposites of each other? Maybe they've heard about that from some, maybe they understand that from culture, but they don't know about the opposite of disgust and fear. This is not part of like a cultural meme that people know about. And so we go to another culture and test if that's how they see facial expressions, with that same opponent architecture. And the answer to that question is yes. So it's a lot of data, but just quick, this is, if you show the anti-faces to people from Canada here is Toronto at that point, Singapore and the Malaysian Peninsula, is that we show that anti-faces are perceived to be the opposite of their associated expression, and that the adaptation effects are also similar across these cultures. So this idea, and we have much more data on this. The general idea that we found is the different cultures see basic expressions as differing in their intensity. They disagree on how much fear maps onto fear, but what they show equivalently is the appreciation of their opponent architecture. They're never going to confuse happy with sad. They're never going to confuse disgust with fear, because they see them as really far apart and in fact opposite. So that idea of opponency is this is something that maybe that Darwin would have supported, is that across cultures that there's an appreciation of facial expressions in terms of their structure as originating from opposites. Okay, the thing that I haven't told you, and this is after all of this, and we could be proud of ourselves thinking that sometimes I actually felt like we discovered something, that in your research career, I mean, you might not feel like I've discovered something, but I felt like I discovered, like I was like, hey, I think, Josh, we discovered something, versus like just collecting data and publishing papers. We were like, we can do that, but it's like, I really think we've discovered something that people don't know about. Then we said like, okay, we could be satisfied with that, but then we posed this question to each other. It's like, well, we haven't answered the fundamental question of why do expressions look the way they do. I'm showing you some evidence that they have some oppositional structure. Well, then why isn't disgust fear, or fear disgust? Why can't we just swap them? Right? They're opposites, or happy and sad. That's maybe a more salient example. Why isn't the sad, mopey face the canonical happy face? It's the opposite of happiness, but why would you have this consistent mapping? Is there a consistent mapping between a particular facial expression structure and a certain state? And everything I've shown you, and maybe that's disappointing, doesn't answer that question. Like I've shown like, oh yeah, there's all of this systematic opponent architecture, but it still doesn't say why happiness would not look like sadness. Why is that? That question I'm not going to answer, by the way. I laid it out there like I was going to give you an answer. But I want to really, can I take that back? Is there like a recording I'd really like to do, because I can't answer that. But you can ask, and I will say I don't know. Ultimately, you'll ask, and I'll give some hand-waving explanation. I can tell you we have focused on certain expressions that we have an account for. Happy and sadness, we don't have a very good account for. So our idea is, the one that I've already told you about, is that this opposition in form maybe originated as an opposition related to sensory regulation. It's really basic. Maybe it seems uninteresting. I think it's part of it is actually, part of its interest to me is how basic it is. It's something that's so obvious when, like I missed it in studying facial expressions, but then when you look at facial expressions, you're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It didn't fit into any existing theories. Okay. So one way that one source of data that made us think that the opposition is related to sensory regulation is a plot of the first underlying principal component of facial expression space in the model. This is what we're viewing here. These are not expressions themselves. This is a visualization of the first component that accounts for the largest amount of variance across the facial exemplar database. Could have turned out to be male, female, could have turned out to be age, gender. This is what it is. Question of what does that reflect? Obviously, the model doesn't tell us that. What we've thought about it is we think this scrunchy face to open face is essentially a closing off of the sensory apertures versus the opening up of the sensory apertures. And this itself also is a discovery, right? Because this is all the data that this comes from are these distinct basic expressions, but what accounts for their overall appearance is this underlying dimension we think of like this stretching or closing the face. This is the fundamental action tendency that facial expressions that we think of as distinct types is built upon. This is what underpins them. If we look at this and map it on to distinct basic expressions, and we've done, Josh did some fancy analyses, so the arrows on here are not to look like Hellraiser. They're actually intended to, these are vector flow diagrams of trying to figure out the movement from fear to disgust and to show that the action patterns are opposing, that they're going in opposing directions. And indeed, these fear and disgust are structurally the most opposing expressions we found. And there is no current theory, except I guess if I had a theory, pits these against each other. So let's stare at this for a little bit. So disgust, what's it for? Okay. And as a basic emotions researcher, you tend to think of, and being one myself to some degree, we think of emotions as adaptations. Disgust, this face seems to go very nicely with this Belgian chocolate. Whereas fear seems to go very nicely to this tiger, which also strangely looks afraid at the same time. This is what we always tell our children. Those animals are also afraid of you. This expression wouldn't be appropriate for this stimulus. This expression might be appropriate for this. Like, if it's summer and you're wearing sandals and you step in it, you would probably make, so there's a combination of fear and disgust. But this idea of there's maybe a mapping between certain expression appearances and stimuli out in the environment we think are related to certain functions. We would call for what we think in terms of disgust is that it's an inspect, reject emotion, and that it's related to either decreased sensory intake or discrimination. It's like, is that really what I think it is? Like, if you're staring at this and you think, like, is it chocolate or is it, should I put this in my mouth if served to me as dessert? You would be surprised. Maybe there'd be some surprise, but then you would look at it and scrutinize it as something that before you would put it in your mouth. In fear, you tend to not scrutinize and discriminate and think like, is that a Bengalese tiger? That's doesn't seem to happen if it shows up in your lab, for instance. That's not the first thing you think about. There's this idea, we think what's happening is vigilance to detection. Like opening up your visual field, increasing sensory intake and sensitivity, that's related to taking in information from the world. This could be related. All of this is hand-waving at the moment. You don't have to believe anything I'm saying, but we will provide some data supporting these suggestions. We think it's related to also augmenting the sensitivity of your visual field. So that's where we've gone, as I will ultimately show you data that this expression enhances discrimination, this expression enhances sensitivity. That's why they look the way they do. Okay, so when we initially published this, it actually got a lot of airplay, and people made a lot of fun of it because it's so damn obvious. Like, so, if you look on YouTube, we'd have these videos. It was on like Good Morning America, and we had like Diane Sawyer making facial expressions, and they were like critiquing the article, like, really, you'd open your eyes when you're afraid? And then, of course, YouTube comments are just nasty like hell, but all of them were basically like, we pay people to do this? And I really wanted to add, yes, you do. So to the general public, they were like, really, your research program is if you open your eyes more, you see more? And the beauty of that is if you ask any psychophysicist, they would be like, yeah, I don't think it works that way. That was so the lay people were like, yeah, of course, and then psychophysicists were like, yeah, I don't think that's like, I don't think that's how it works. We have an iris, like I don't really know what's, and so we actually had to do some basic experiments to see if changing the aperture of the eyes influenced visual field size. Indeed, it does. So what we find is that, and one of the things to note is that, so this is neutral here, so all the effects I'm going to show are suggesting there are oppositions. Right? So what fear and disgust as being oppositely structured do opposite things for perception. So in this case, the first experiment was looking at visual field size, and we show that not only does disgust limit or close off your visual field, maybe that's not so surprising, you're squinting, the opening of the eyes, and what we think is really happening, why you open your eyes is that you have a lower visual field that's due, one, to your brows and to your eyelids, and these are occluding features. And what you're doing is moving the occlusion away, expanding your visual field by opening your eyes. However, if that was the end of it, maybe it wouldn't be so interesting. What I really think one of the stronger adaptations related to eye aperture is the idea of the trade-off between acuity and sensitivity. So if whether you know about the eye or you are a photographer, you take pictures and you think about f-stops and apertures and opening up an aperture or closing down an aperture, pupil dilation, pupil constriction. What happens with pupil dilation? You become really sensitive to light at the expense of acuity. When your eyes are dilated, light becomes painful because you're actually changing the sensitivity of your visual system to light. When you constrict the pupils, you have the opposite. You actually have further depth of field. You have more acuity at the expense of the amount of light coming in and sensitivity. So here, my student Dan, who does this work with eyes, has shown that mathematically it makes a lot of sense. This is what we would predict if we were to measure acuity and sensitivity from making facial expressions, the aperture change that we found in the average expressions of fear and disgust. That is, as you move from fear, open, to disgust, narrowing, you're going to have an increase in acuity. As you open, if you go from disgust to opening to fear, you're going to have enhanced sensitivity. There's a trade-off between them. And indeed, when we've measured this with, we've looked at visual field sensitivity, doing visual field mapping, asking, having Humphrey's visual field analyzer while people are making these facial expressions. Again, they're not emotions. We're just asking people to pose these expressions, and we map out their visual field to see how it's changed. And so what I've shown here in green, that's a little bit hard to see, is the fovea. What we find with fear expressions is fear expressions basically change the sensitivity to light throughout your visual field. And disgust is at the expense, when you narrow your eyes, not just you're closing off your visual field, even in the fovea, you find that there is a dampening of sensitivity. So opening, closing your eyes is not just visual field bigger and smaller, it's related to how sensitive, regulating the sensitivity of your eye to light. And so this is just showing that the amount of peripheral sensitivity is related to the amount of central sensitivity. What that means is the more you open your eyes, the more sensitive our measures are in the fovea. The reason why I care about this is I'm not just trying to show you the same old results where we're just making the visual field size bigger. When you're opening your eyes, you're letting in more light, and that's not just influencing perception of the things in the periphery, this is influencing your fovea, around your fovea. It's adjusting the sensitivity of your fovea to incoming information. Disgust, disgust, is it only impairing vision? No, it does the opposite. So what we find is that going from fear to disgust it decreases sensitivity, that's what's shown here, but in contrast, it's a trade-off with acuity, right? That's the fundamental, it's like going between two visual systems, rods and cones. But this is in control, this is parasympathetic, sympathetic dilation of your iris, but it's now under the control of emotions. It's suggesting like, and we think that why isn't it just pupil dilation constriction is because that this is faster. So pupil dilation and constriction actually has this longer time course. You can activate the muscles in your eyes much more rapidly than you can to changing pupil dilation and constriction. Indeed, many of the same neural mechanisms are involved. And so we think of there's this disgust as being parasympathetic and narrowing the pupils and narrowing the aperture, and fear is sympathetic. It opens the pupils, dilates, opens the aperture of the eyes. That's what that's part of what a facial expression is. Disgust also and fear also have some influence. The other salient aspect is the stretching of the mouth, which involves the activation of the risorius and platysma, these ligaments that actually stretch the side of the mouth. It's a weird thing. You know, when you see it, you wonder, like, why is that a really good sign for fear? Like, is this, I mean, that's the counter to what I'm trying to say to you. It's like, no, actually, this here is a really good way to communicate fear, versus this does something for the sender that's useful, and then we end up picking up on it as a symbol or a signal of someone's state. Well, we think this is related to dilating the nasal passages. And indeed, when some of the first measures we did were of nasal inspiration. We do lots of fancy control measures for this. So we've measured through a tachometer, but we also measured through a nasal thermistor, where it's a little probe that we put under the nostril so that just in case facial expressions are changing the seal on this mask. So we have this control measure that's not susceptible to that. And what we show is not only does fear augment the amount of air that you can take in, disgust does exactly the opposite, that it's narrowing or it's decreasing the amount of air intake. You might argue that this is due to some kind of demands of making these facial expressions of something being harder or easier. We wanted to show that it's actually related to the invisible morphometry of the nasal passages. I've had someone say to me, well, like, why did you have to do this study? It's like, well, because this is science, damn it. You just can't believe me. That I was like, there are a whole bunch of reasons why. It could be like, okay, if you want to accept my story, but I didn't accept it. It's like, maybe disgust and fear differ in terms of difficulty. And what we did is in that study is that we did control for effort with a strain gauge. We did the best we could, but we didn't know if that was really accounting for the results. What we really wanted to say is that facial expression appearance is related to the changes in the underlying nasal morphometry. And what we found is, indeed, that's the case. So facial expressions of disgust close off the nasal passages, whereas facial expressions of fear dilate the nasal passages. This was the first imaging study that I did at Toronto, focusing on the nose. It was very upsetting to the MR physicist. Okay, I've pretty much run out of time because I've been taking this leisurely pace and being very chatty. So now I'm going to go into hyperdrive. So the last part of this, and so feel free, like if you have to go, I understand, I won't take a few more minutes, is the idea of acceptation. How these expressions have been co-opted for social communication. Dan has worked on a lot. Dan Lee, who's graduating this year, has focused on the receiver end. Okay, so I've been focusing on how it helps the sender. How do we transmit this to be a signal? Here I'm arguing all the benefits are for the sender, but now we want to say they are transmitted to be a socially valuable signal. One way we've done that is to show that wider eyes enhance gaze discrimination. So if you are trying to figure out where someone's looking, so imagine I express fear, there's something in the environment, I'm looking somewhere. Can you enhance the propagation of the signal of where I'm looking? And indeed, the answer is yes. What fear expressions are doing are enhancing the ability to localize where someone is looking. And that is also related to peripheral cueing. So this is a correlation between iris area. So we found it's the amount of iris that's shown correlates with how fast you can pick up on a target, an eccentric target in the environment. This is not attention. This is the confound for attention, but that's my effect. We invert the eyes, we try to remove all of the fear effects. It's really about the physical salience. What you're doing by opening your eyes is not making people feel fear so that they're attending more. It's actually showing more of your iris. And that's a better, more salient signal to say, where are you looking? Another part that Dan has worked on is reading mental states from the eyes. So we all believe, and there's data to show, that we can read very sophisticated things about someone's mind from their eyes. We have tried to look at the features that are related to that. And our argument is that that's based on the sensory functions of the eyes. And so one way of looking at this is kind of neat. We looked at, I think it's kind of neat, this is a circumplex of 50 different complex mental state adjectives based on, that are ratings of what people see just in the eyes from basic expressions. So here's fear, surprise, joy, sadness, disgust, and anger. First thing to notice, and the most important thing, is that disgust and fear eyes are opposite of each other again, and they're rated to their mental states. What you think someone's feeling is opposite. And also, not only are they opposite, there's this, you see this weird shift where almost all the adjectives are on one side and very few on the other. That could just be a confound, like we're really bad about picking adjectives. But what I really think it is that fear, opening your eyes, is highly diagnostic. You don't actually need to discriminate to know what someone's thinking. You have very few options. When someone opens their eyes, you're pretty sure of the mental states of what they're feeling. And so you have, whereas when you have narrow eyes, it actually just requires discrimination. Just exactly kind of like what they do for the perceivers. For the senders, like if someone's giving you that face and they're like, this could be about ideas, you see it a lot. You tell someone about your new grant idea and they do. What is that? Why would you do that? It's because you're scrutinizing. That's the function of this. It's metaphorical, but it is a co-option or an adapting of the original function to increase acuity, to see. But now it's in this abstract domain. And so we think that's what this shift reveals. Okay, I have to finish. So I'm going to finish just by saying, and I should be invited back for another talk on this topic, where we do the same thing, just trying to show how high-level disgust, social judgment, is related to the sensory rejection of bitter tastes, that the expression of bitterness ends up being co-opted for social purposes. So we have a paper from Hannah Chapman. There's Hannah, who's now a professor at Brooklyn College, used EMG to show that the facial expressions to tasting something bitter and bad, the activation of the levator labii, the raising of the lips, is not only present in disgust to things that aren't really about eating, but also in the social moral domain. So in being treated unfairly in an economic exchange. So the idea here is you're activating this facial muscle that was related to some potential sensory function related to something tasting bad and regulating the senses, and now it has nothing at all to do with taste or smell. And that's what we think, that's our argument, that higher level social functions are piggybacking on some basic sensory regulatory functions. And that in the present day, these facial expressions might be more about, hey, you're cheating me out of $5. That's, I feel disgust related to that. But the reason why it looks the way it does is related to that it originated from chemosensory regulation, that did taste or smell bad. I really can't talk about the brain stuff. We show this is true in the brain. There's a whole bunch of brain stuff. I actually do neuroscience. You wouldn't know it by this talk. Showing that the insular cortex, the taste fields in the insular cortex are co-opted for moral disgust. So this is not just something about facial expressions. We can show this both in terms of the insular cortex to tastes, to bitter tastes, to disgusting pictures, and to unfair versus fair offers in an economic game. And much of our work that Junichi has been working on is using information mapping to say that information mapping is not to point to a bitter region, it's to say some population code, some cluster of activation represents disgust. In doing that, we found that gustatory cortex, we map out gustatory cortex and show that gustatory cortex can actually classify disgust pictures. Like, this area was defined as being able to classify what taste you're tasting, and it also can classify what picture you're looking at and say, oh yeah, I can see it's disgusting. And further, if you ask what taste you think this disgusting picture is, they'll say it tastes like bitter. Whereas fear pictures don't result in a bitter response in the brain. So the general idea then is form, function. You got that part. We talked about that a lot. Facial expressions, but this also applies to a general algorithm for emotions, that we think that these sensory regulatory functions have been co-opted for social regulation. Although they're far removed from their sensory origins, but they really, we think a lot of complex social moral judgment is related to these simpler sensory processes. And thank you for entertaining me by looking and sitting here smiling and things for my extra time. And thanks for people in my lab. Thank you.